The Hudson River does not give up its dead easily. But on a gray morning in late October, the water had no choice. Fishermen spotted the body first, pale against the dark current, tangled in weeds near the shoreline. They called the police, and soon the sirens came. By the time the officers dragged it onto the rocky bank, the media was already circling like vultures. Yellow tape went up, reporters shoved microphones toward anyone in uniform, and the story began to write itself. Middle-aged man, found in the Hudson. Signs of drowning. Another poor soul who couldn't handle the pressure. But this wasn't just any man. The ID in his wallet read, Richard Hanley. Hanley wasn't a criminal, a drifter, or a forgotten addict. He was the treasurer of Davenport Global, one of the most prestigious international trading firms in New York City. For 25 years, he had balanced the company's books with almost religious devotion. Colleagues called him meticulous, incorruptible, the man who could find a missing cent in a billion-dollar account. And now he was dead. The initial reports were simple, almost convenient. A man burdened by guilt. A man who cracked under pressure. A man who stole millions and then chose the river as his confession. By noon, newspapers were already printing headlines. Treasurer stole $10 million, then took his own life. It was clean. It was fast. It was believable. But it was also wrong. The autopsy would soon show bruises circling his neck, the unmistakable imprint of strangulation. His lungs held no river water. Richard Hanley had been dead before he ever touched the current. So if Hanley didn't drown, who wanted him gone? Why would a quiet, careful man vanish one night with $10 million missing from the company vault only to turn up in the river days later, murdered? Why did Davenport Global, a company once hailed as a model of American capitalism, suddenly rush to distance itself from its most loyal employee? And what did Richard Hanley discover in those ledgers he guarded so fiercely? This is not just a story of one man's death. It is the story of a machine, a network of money, power, and silence. A machine that chews up anyone who dares to expose its gears. Richard Hanley tried to stop it. For that, he was erased. In the world of money, the truth is often more expensive than life itself. Richard Hanley had been the treasurer of Davenport Global Trading, a New York-based multinational import-export giant, for nearly 25 years. In the corporate corridors of Wall Street, people referred to him simply as the treasurer. At 53, with thinning gray hair and a pair of old-fashioned wire-rimmed glasses, Richard lived a quiet life in the suburbs of New Jersey. He drove the same 10-year-old sedan, lived in a modest two-story home, and was known as a devoted husband and father. His wife, Ellen, was a retired schoolteacher. His son, Michael, was in college. To colleagues, Richard was the definition of reliability. Punctual, meticulous, and incorruptible. His motto never changed in 25 years. Every cent must be accounted for. Money never disappears without a reason. Coworkers often joked that Richard was the company's human safe. Some admired his discipline. Others thought he was naive for believing integrity still mattered in corporate America. From the outside, Davenport Global was a picture of success. Its headquarters, a sleek glass tower on Park Avenue, symbolized modern corporate power. The lobby gleamed with marble floors and towering LED screens flashing stock prices and global contracts. Business magazines praised Davenport as a model American corporation. With billions in annual revenue and contracts stretching from Latin America to Asia, it was the pride of Wall Street. Executives gave confident interviews, posing as visionaries of global trade. But behind closed doors, whispers told another story. Employees spoke in hushed tones about a slush fund. Millions of dollars in unrecorded cash moved quietly through offshore accounts. Some claimed it was used to bribe foreign officials. Others suspected political payoffs in Washington. Richard had heard the rumors for years, but he never joined the gossip. He believed that as long as he kept the books honest, the truth would eventually come to light. Yet deep down, he knew Davenport was not as clean as its glossy annual report suggested. Among the executive team, one figure stood out: Thomas Keene, the company's chief financial officer. Charismatic, 40-something, with slicked back hair and a perpetual smirk, Keene embodied the new breed of Wall Street elite. He wore Patek Philippe watches, drove Lamborghinis, and posted photos from his Hamptons Beach house. To investors, Keene was the financial genius who took Davenport public. To insiders, he was a man who lived far beyond his salary, a man whose connections with lobbyists and shadowy consultants raised questions no one dared to ask aloud. Richard often saw his signature authorizing questionable withdrawals. He raised quiet objections, but was waved off with lines like, "It's above your pay grade, Hanley. Don't overthink it." A few of Richard's closest colleagues, young accountants who saw him as a mentor, noticed his growing unease. He was no longer the calm, steady treasurer they knew. Lately, he stared at spreadsheets with furrowed brows, tapping his pen nervously, his shoulders weighed down by something unsaid. One whispered to another, "He's carrying something. He looks like a man who knows too much." Davenport's headquarters sparkled under the morning sun, but Richard felt a chill every time he walked through its glass doors. Deals were announced with champagne in the boardroom, yet in the back offices, men whispered about cash movements that left no paper trail. The deeper Richard went into the numbers, the heavier the air around him became. Success, power, prestige, Davenport had it all. But to Richard, the company was no longer a shining tower. It was a labyrinth of secrets, and he was standing at its center with no way out. And he did not yet realize his insistence on integrity, the very trait that defined his career, had already painted a target on his back. It began with numbers. Richard Hanley had reviewed thousands of ledgers over the course of his 25-year career. He was the kind of man who could sense a discrepancy before he even put pen to paper, a sixth sense developed from decades of balancing sheets and hunting for errors that others overlooked. But this time, what he found was no minor mistake. The figure sat there on the screen of his office computer, $10 million. Withdrawn. Gone. No invoice. No receipt. No supporting document. A black hole in the middle of Davenport Global's balance sheet. Richard blinked, rubbed his tired eyes, and went back through the system. He traced every transaction, every transfer, every approval chain. Still nothing. $10 million had been moved out of the company's reserves without leaving so much as a digital fingerprint. The next morning, Richard carried a printed report into the executive suite. He knocked on the CFO's door. Thomas Keene was sipping espresso in his corner office, the Manhattan skyline glittering behind him like a personal trophy. He barely looked up when Richard entered. "I need to talk about a transaction," Richard said, holding the papers with a trembling hand. Keene smirked. "Transaction? Hanley, we do thousands of those every week. This one's different. $10 million. No requisition order. No backup documentation. Nothing." For a moment, silence. Keene set down his cup, leaned back in his leather chair, and regarded Richard with a look that was equal parts amusement and contempt. "Don't worry about it," Keene said coolly. "That's handled at levels above yours. Just file it under executive disbursements." Richard's jaw tightened. "You know I can't do that. The books won't reconcile. If an auditor—" Keene cut him off with a raised hand. His voice dropped lower. "Richard, let it go. You've been around long enough to know how things work here. Don't ask questions you don't want the answers to." The treasurer stood frozen, the report still in his grip. The conversation was over. He left Keene's office feeling something he hadn't felt in decades of service: fear. From that day, strange things began happening. Leaving the office late one evening, Richard noticed a black sedan idling across the street. He walked past it, heart thumping, pretending not to look. The car pulled out slowly and kept its distance as he drove away. At first he told himself it was coincidence. New York was full of cars. But then it happened again. And again. Always the same type of car. Always appearing when he left the office late. One night, as he crossed the George Washington Bridge on his way home, headlights filled his rearview mirror bright. Too close, tailgating him. He changed lanes. The car followed. He accelerated. It stayed on his bumper until suddenly, without warning, it swerved off at an exit ramp and disappeared. Richard arrived home that night shaking, too rattled to tell Ellen what had happened. He sat at the kitchen table long after she'd gone to bed, staring at the ledger printouts, the missing 10 million glaring back at him like an accusation. Then came the email. It arrived in his inbox on a Thursday morning. The sender field was blank, the address scrambled nonsense. The subject line was a single word, warning. The message was short. Stop asking questions. Stay quiet if you value your life. Richard's palms went cold. He looked around the office, but no one else seemed to notice his expression. People typed at their desks, phones rang, printers hummed. The normal buzz of corporate life went on as if nothing had happened. He printed the email, folded it into his pocket, and deleted it from the system. That night, he locked the paper in his desk drawer, but the words echoed in his mind long after he lay awake in bed. For the first time in his life, Richard began keeping a private journal. He wrote in careful, almost frantic handwriting, the way a man records something not for himself, but for those who might find it later. There's a hole in the books. 10 million. No trace. I asked questions and got silence. Something is wrong, very wrong. They know I've seen it. I don't know how much time I have left. Each entry grew darker, more desperate. Ellen noticed his late nights in the home office, the way he locked the drawer before coming to bed. When she asked what troubled him, Richard only smiled weakly and said, "Just work stress. Nothing you need to worry about." But the truth was, Richard had begun to feel like a marked man. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of the secret pressed harder on him. He stopped joining coworkers for lunch. He avoided social gatherings. He double-checked the locks on his car and the doors of his house. His colleagues whispered about how pale he looked, how distracted. One of the younger accountants asked gently if he was okay. Richard forced a smile, but his hand shook as he raised his coffee. At night, in his study, he reread the numbers. $10 million vanished into thin air. But Richard knew better. Money never just disappeared. It had gone somewhere and someone had wanted it hidden. And whoever they were, they wanted him silent. Richard Hanley was not yet dead. But every step he took, every page he flipped, every breath he drew in those days carried the same invisible shadow. The sense that he was walking closer and closer to the edge of something fatal. The last day of Richard Hanley's life at Davenport Global began like any other. He arrived at the office shortly after 8, his worn leather briefcase tucked under his arm, his shirt pressed as neatly as if he were still a young man on his first day of work. No one could have guessed that by nightfall, he would vanish without a trace. Co-workers recalled later how Richard looked tired but composed. He chatted briefly with the receptionist, asked one of the junior accountants if she'd had a chance to reconcile last week's petty cash, and took his usual black coffee with 1 sugar. But those who worked closest to him noticed something unusual. He spent the entire morning going through ledgers with a fierce intensity, pulling old files, double-checking cross-entries. He made several calls, each cut short when someone entered the room. At lunch, he didn't join the others. Instead, he sat at his desk, staring at a single folder for nearly an hour. By evening, most of the building had emptied. Secretaries packed their things, accountants shut down their computers, lights in the hallways flicked off one by one. Richard stayed. At 7:45 p.m., a security guard noted in his log that Mr. Hanley was still in the building, working late. At 8:02 p.m., surveillance cameras captured him walking down the corridor toward the restricted vault room, a heavy black briefcase in his hand. What happened next remains a mystery. The camera outside the vault recorded him swiping his keycard, entering the secure area, and disappearing inside. For 3 minutes, the hallway stood empty. Then, inexplicably, the footage cut to static. When the video resumed, the vault door was closed. Richard never re-emerged. By 9:30 p.m., Ellen, his wife, grew worried. Richard was always home by then unless he called. She dialed his Finino answer. She dialed again, straight to voicemail. At 10:15, she tried his office line, but the building had already switched to night mode. Security guards made their rounds, saw nothing unusual. At 11:45, Ellen called the police to report her husband missing. The officer on the line assured her it was probably nothing, that maybe he had gone for a drink or stayed overnight in the city. But Ellen knew better. Richard never broke routine. The following morning, Davenport Global's finance department erupted in chaos. At 8:15 a.m., a junior accountant attempting to balance the previous day's ledgers discovered the missing funds. $10 million in cash, withdrawn from company reserves. No paperwork. No approval trail. Just gone. By 9 o'clock, word had reached the executive floor. Within minutes, whispers spread. The treasurer took it. He's disappeared. Reporters camped outside Davenport's headquarters by noon, cameras flashing as suited executives brushed past without comment. The New York Times ran the first headline. Treasurer stole $10 million, vanished into the night. By evening, every major network carried the story. Anchors described Richard Hanley, once a respected company man, as a trusted insider who had finally snapped under pressure, absconding with a fortune and leaving his family behind. At the Hanley home in New Jersey, the narrative was unbearable. Reporters swarmed the quiet suburban street, shoving microphones at Ellen and Michael. Ellen refused to speak, clutching her son's arm as she pushed through the crowd. Behind her, their modest two-story house looked unchanged. No missing suitcases, no empty drawers, no sign that Richard had planned an escape. Friends and neighbors were stunned. Richard? Run off with $10 million, one said, shaking his head. The man clipped coupons and mowed his own lawn. But the media frenzy was relentless. Tabloids plastered his photo under bold captions. The treasurer who betrayed Wall Street. Detectives arrived at Davenport the next day, combing through the vault room. The surveillance footage raised more questions than it answered. Yes, it showed Richard entering. But no footage showed him leaving. Technicians examined the security system. The gap in recording 3 minutes of static was brushed off as a technical glitch. Yet Richard's disappearance coincided exactly with that gap. Inside the vault room, nothing was out of place. No blood. No struggle. No sign of forced entry. Just an empty cash compartment where $10 million should have been. Why would a man with 25 years of loyalty suddenly steal a fortune? Why leave his family, his home, his entire life without warning? And where was he now? The company issued a statement expressing shock and disappointment at the betrayal of trust. Stock prices wavered. Executives insisted they were cooperating with authorities. Behind closed doors, some whispered that Richard had always been too rigid, that maybe he had cracked under pressure. Others suggested he had accomplices. But Ellen kept repeating the same words. He didn't do this. He would never do this. Privately, detectives weren't so sure. Richard's reputation for honesty didn't square with the missing millions. But neither did the state of his home. No packed bags. No missing passport. No unexplained withdrawals from his personal accounts. If he had run, he had done so with nothing but the clothes on his back. And then there was the strange detail one officer noted in his report. A small leather-bound notebook on Richard's desk at home, locked in a drawer. Inside, pages filled with numbers, cryptic notes, and one line scribbled only days before he disappeared. There's a black hole in the books. 10 million. I fear I've run out of time. Richard Hanley had walked into Davenport Global's vault room at 8:02 p.m. on a Thursday night. Cameras showed him entering with a briefcase. He never walked out. By Friday morning, the world believed he had stolen $10 million. But those who knew him best feared something far worse. It was a gray morning on the Hudson when a jogger spotted something tangled near the shoreline. At first, she thought it was driftwood. But as she drew closer, the shape resolved into something far more horrific. A body, swollen and pale, bobbing against the rocks. She screamed and dialed 911. Within an hour, police boats and forensic vans lined the riverbank. Reporters swarmed the scene. Helicopters circled overhead. The news hit the wires before noon. Missing treasurer found dead in Hudson River. By evening, every channel carried the story. Treasurer who stole $10 million dead by apparent suicide. Fugitive executive found floating in Hudson. From trusted insider to thief to tragedy. Anchors speculated he had panicked after his daring heist, that the pressure of hiding $10 million had driven him to despair. The narrative was simple, sensational, and easy to sell. Embezzler turned runaway, killed by his own guilt. But the medical examiner's office told a different story. Dr. Lisa Marquez, the chief forensic pathologist, unzipped the body bag late that afternoon. Richard Hanley's corpse bore the ravages of a week in the water, but certain details were undeniable. Around his neck, deep bruises curved like the imprint of a rope or cord. His wrists showed faint abrasions, as if bound. More telling still, when the lungs were examined, they were nearly empty. Not the waterlogged organs of a drowning victim, but the lungs of a man who had stopped breathing long before his body ever touched the river. Cause of death: strangulation. The ruling was clear. Richard Hanley had not drowned. He had been murdered, his corpse dumped into the Hudson to mimic suicide. When the findings leaked, the media frenzy shifted. The next morning's headlines were less certain. Treasurer's death raises questions. Murder or suicide? Autopsy challenges narrative. Detectives now faced a crime scene with no witnesses, no clear suspects, and $10 million still missing. If Richard had stolen the money, where was it? And if he hadn't, who had silenced him and why? Ellen Hanley broke her silence the day after the autopsy. Standing on the front steps of her suburban home, cameras flashing in her face, she clutched her son's arm and spoke into the microphones. Her voice trembled, but carried an unmistakable conviction. My husband was an honest man. He was not a thief. He was not greedy. He was murdered because he found something he wasn't supposed to see. The clip aired on every major network. For the first time, the public began to doubt the story they had been fed. Could it be that the quiet, meticulous treasurer had been the victim, not the villain? Detectives returned to Davenport Global. They re-examined the vault, grilled security staff, and replayed the corrupted footage again and again. How had Richard entered with a briefcase and never come out? The company issued another press statement, this time careful with its words. We are deeply saddened by Mr. Hanley's tragic passing. We are cooperating fully with the authorities. But behind the polished language, unease rippled through the building. Employees whispered in break rooms, avoiding eye contact with executives. Everyone knew something more sinister was at play. Richard's funeral drew hundreds. Neighbors, former colleagues, even old schoolmates came to pay respects. The church overflowed with mourners, the air heavy with disbelief. Ellen stood at the pulpit, her hands gripping the wood as she spoke. Richard lived his life with honesty. If he is gone, it is because honesty became too dangerous. The congregation fell into silence. Some wept openly. Others clenched their fists, anger simmering. The death of a quiet man had become something larger, a symbol of how power and money could corrupt so deeply that truth itself became fatal. Detectives followed lead after lead, but the trail was murky. No large personal deposits appeared in Richard's accounts. No offshore transfers linked to his name. If the treasurer hadn't taken the $10 million, then who had? And why had Richard been the one to pay with his life? The unanswered questions hung heavy in the air, feeding the sense that a shadowy hand was steering the narrative. The media began to fracture. Some outlets clung to the thief-turned-suicide story. Others started digging, interviewing former employees, tracing whispers of slush funds and political payoffs. A New York Post headline asked bluntly, "Who wanted the treasurer dead?" For the first time, the story was no longer about stolen money, it was about a man silenced, a truth buried in the river. Richard Hanley had lived quietly, without luxury or scandal, for 53 years. Yet in death, his name became a storm. And beneath the headlines, one truth grew harder and harder to ignore. He had not taken the money. Someone else had. And whoever they were, they had made sure Richard would never tell the world what he knew. The NYPD was ready to shelve the case. The official line was simple. Richard Hanley had stolen $10 million, regretted it, and ended his life. The fact that the autopsy pointed to strangulation rather than drowning was labeled inconclusive. Files were being shuffled toward closure. But one man refused to let the story die. His name was Mark Delaney, a freelance investigative reporter with a reputation for chasing stories no one else wanted. Delaney had covered organized crime, corrupt unions, even city hall scandals. He had a nose for rot beneath polished surfaces, and to him, Davenport Global smelled like a landfill. When Richard's body was pulled from the Hudson, Delaney was one of the first on scene, camera slung around his neck, notebook ready. Something about the quiet treasurer's story didn't add up. Men like Hanley don't just flip overnight, he told a colleague. If he went down, someone pushed him. Delaney's instincts were rewarded when an envelope slid under his office door one rainy afternoon. No return address. Inside, photocopies of internal financial records. Transactions flagged, dates highlighted, amounts circled. All arrows pointed offshore. The trail began with Davenport's main accounts, then fractured into shell companies with names like Orion Holdings and Blue Shore Investments, entities registered in Zurich and the Cayman Islands. From there, the money was layered through a dizzying maze of transfers, classic laundering technique. At the center sat the missing $10 million. Richard hadn't stolen it. He had traced it. Delaney worked with a financial analyst friend to decode the flow. Step 1. A transfer from Davenport's reserve fund into a Zurich account under Orion Holdings. Step 2. A rapid split into 3 Cayman accounts. Step 3. Re-entry into Europe disguised as consulting fees. By the time it looped back, the origin was unrecognizable. The $10 million had vanished into the black ocean of offshore secrecy. Somebody built a highway for dirty money, Delaney muttered, staring at the charts. And Hanley stepped right in front of traffic. One evening, Delaney received a call from a block number. The voice on the other end was trembling. "I worked with Richard," the caller said. "I can't talk long." Delaney pressed for details. The voice continued. "He wasn't planning to run. He had a file proof of everything. He told me he was going to the district attorney. He said, 'Tomorrow, they'll know the truth.'" The line went dead. Delaney sat frozen. Richard had intended to blow the whistle. He hadn't lived long enough to try. 2 weeks later, Richard's widow, Ellen, invited Delaney to their home. She had seen him on television, talking about the inconsistencies in the case, and she trusted him more than the police. From a locked drawer in Richard's study, she produced a small leather-bound notebook, the same one detectives had logged but dismissed as irrelevant. The final page was ripped almost in half, jagged along the edge. Only part of a sentence remained. "If tomorrow I don't come back." Ellen's hands shook as she held it out. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew they would kill him." Delaney photographed every page. When Delaney approached Davenport Global for comment, the company issued a terse statement. "We categorically deny any wrongdoing. Davenport is cooperating fully with investigators. We mourn the loss of Mr. Hanley, but reject baseless speculation." Yet inside sources painted a darker picture. Employees spoke of sudden resignations, shredded documents, midnight visits by men in suits. One claimed the IT department was ordered to wipe entire servers within days of Richard's death. The smell of panic was unmistakable. Delaney's first article hit the press under the headline, "The treasurer didn't run, he was silenced." The piece outlined the offshore trail, the autopsy inconsistencies, the widow's testimony. It went viral. Soon television panels debated whether Davenport was covering up a billion-dollar fraud. Politicians demanded hearings. Investors panicked. Davenport's stock plummeted. But Delaney also received threats. Anonymous voicemails. "Back off, Delaney. You don't know who you're dealing with." Hanley didn't listen. Look what happened. He refused to stop. The deeper he dug, the more connections appeared. The Cayman accounts weren't just tied to Davenport, they linked to other multinationals, to shell companies feeding campaign donations, even to construction projects awarded to suspicious contractors. It wasn't just corporate fraud. It was a network of power, politicians, businessmen, organized crime. Richard Hanley had stumbled onto a machine far larger than he could have imagined. And for daring to expose it, he had been erased. Under mounting public pressure, the NYPD reluctantly reopened the investigation. Detectives quietly admitted that Delaney's findings matched fragments from Richard's files. The embezzler theory no longer held. But reopening the case brought new obstacles. Evidence had vanished. Key witnesses refused to testify. Every subpoena was met with an army of lawyers. It was as if invisible hands were steering the investigation back into silence. Richard Hanley had been a quiet treasurer, a man of balance sheets and ledgers. Yet in death, he had become a symbol. His final, unfinished words, "If tomorrow I don't come back," echoed like a prophecy. He hadn't come back, and the truth he died for was only beginning to surface. The storm finally broke in the summer of the following year. For months, journalist Mark Delaney's reporting had been piling pressure on authorities, shredding the official narrative that Richard Hanley had stolen the money and killed himself. The whispers inside Davenport Global grew too loud to ignore. Investors demanded accountability, and prosecutors, embarrassed by the public backlash, were forced to act. At the center of the storm was Thomas Keene, Davenport's chief financial officer. Keene had always cultivated an image of untouchable success. He arrived at the office in Italian sports cars, his wrist flashing with Swiss timepieces worth more than most people's annual salaries. At charity galas, he smiled for the cameras, standing shoulder to shoulder with senators and CEOs. But beneath the polish, cracks appeared. Delaney obtained leaked emails between Keene and offshore consultants. The language was coded but unmistakable, references to special accounts, sensitive transfers, and executive approvals. One message read bluntly: "Funds have been moved to Orion Holdings per instruction. Ensure Hanley is kept out of the loop." Another showed Keene joking with a colleague about feeding the slush monster. The evidence was damning. Even more incriminating were financial records uncovered by forensic accountants working with federal investigators. The missing $10 million traced directly back to Keene's authorizations. Though he tried to claim ignorance, the paper trail revealed his fingerprints on every transaction. A confidential witness later revealed, as one of Hanley's junior accountants testified, that Richard had confronted Keene about the irregularities. Within days, Richard was dead. But Keene was not acting alone. The investigation revealed Davenport's slush fund stretched far beyond Zurich and the Caymans. Transfers linked the company to shadowy firms tied to Eastern European organized crime. Payments were funneled into lobbying groups that supported senators' campaigns. Multinational corporations appeared in the ledgers, moving cash in exchange for lucrative contracts overseas. Richard had stumbled onto a global web of corruption, and Keene, arrogant and careless, had left just enough of a trail for prosecutors to follow. The day federal agents raided Keene's Hamptons estate, the scene was almost cinematic. Neighbors watched in disbelief as black SUVs rolled up the driveway, agents in windbreakers storming the front door. Keene emerged in handcuffs, still wearing a silk robe, his face twisted between shock and fury. Onlookers cheered as he was shoved into the back of a government vehicle. For Richard's widow, Ellen, watching the footage on TV brought a bittersweet sense of justice. But she also knew Keene's arrest was just the beginning. When the trial opened in Manhattan federal court, the media called it the trial of the decade. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. Crowds gathered every morning, chanting slogans, waving signs that read, "Justice for Hanley," and "Follow the money." Inside, the prosecution laid out its case. Keene orchestrated the siphoning of millions into offshore accounts. Hanley discovered the fraud and prepared to expose it. Keene, with help from associates, had Hanley silenced. They presented the jury with emails, transaction records, witness testimony, and, most hauntingly, Hanley's torn journal page. "If tomorrow I don't come back." The courtroom sat in stunned silence as those words were read aloud. Keene's lawyers fought viciously. They painted Richard as a depressed man, overwhelmed by pressure, who might have staged his own disappearance. They claimed the emails were taken out of context, the financial trail circumstantial. But the prosecution's evidence was too strong. The jury saw through the smokescreen. And then came the bombshell. During cross-examination, a witness casually mentioned that Hanley wasn't the first Davenport employee to raise concerns about missing funds. 3 others had died in accidents, over the past 5 years. A mid-level auditor killed in a mysterious car crash. An IT specialist who supposedly overdosed. A compliance officer who fell from his apartment balcony. Each had been involved, in some way, with internal financial reviews. The courtroom gasped. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't just one murder. It was a campaign of silencing. After 6 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated less than 2 days. They found Thomas Keene guilty on multiple counts: wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and second-degree murder. When the judge read the sentence, life imprisonment without parole, applause erupted in the gallery. Ellen Hanley wept silently, clutching her son's hand. Justice, at least in part, had been served. Yet as the gavel fell, many questions remained unanswered. What about the senators whose campaigns were funded by slush money? The multinational firms tied to the same offshore accounts? The shadowy figures in Eastern Europe who had received Davenport's consulting fees? None of them were on trial. Keene had been sacrificed, but the machinery of corruption remained intact. On the last day of the trial, Delaney published his most explosive article yet. He revealed that prosecutors had suppressed evidence linking Davenport's slush fund directly to government contracts worth billions. Pressure from above had forced them to keep the trial narrowly focused on Keene. The implication was chilling. Richard Hanley had died not just because of one greedy CFO, but because he had threatened to expose a system that reached into the highest corridors of power. Richard's name would forever be tied to the scandal. But for Ellen and Michael, the verdict was only partial closure. They knew the men who had truly ordered his death still walked free, their suits pressed, their hands clean. For the public, the case was both vindication and warning. Greed could be punished, but only when it suited those in power. At a memorial service held months later, a former colleague spoke softly to the crowd. Richard Hanley died for the truth. But the truth didn't die with him. It lives in all of us, waiting to be told. The congregation bowed their heads. Outside, cameras clicked. And somewhere in the city, in glass towers untouched by scandal, the powerful men behind the curtain went on with business as usual. The rain had stopped by the time the funeral began. A pale sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the small chapel in New Jersey, casting fractured colors across the wooden pews. The place was crowded: former colleagues, neighbors, strangers who had only known Richard Hanley through the news. They came not for the scandal, but for the man they believed had been wronged. At the front, the coffin rested under a modest wreath of lilies. Beside it, Ellen Hanley clutched her husband's framed photograph. Her eyes were swollen, but she held her head high. Michael, their son, stood protectively by her side, his jaw tight, as if he were holding back both grief and anger. One by one, people rose to speak. A young accountant from Davenport's finance team stepped to the podium. Her voice shook as she recalled late nights at the office when Richard would quietly guide her through endless rows of numbers. "He used to tell me," she said, "every cent has a story. You just have to be honest enough to listen." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Others followed, neighbors recalling Richard fixing a leaky roof without asking for payment. Colleagues remembering his sharp humor hidden beneath his quiet exterior. For a brief moment, the scandal outside seemed to fade. Here, Richard was not the embezzler or the man in the river. He was a husband, a father, a friend. Outside, news vans lined the street. Cameramen captured every tear, every embrace. That evening, the headlines softened. Treasurer remembered as a man of integrity. Colleagues call Hanley a martyr for the truth. For a week, his story dominated the airwaves. Editorials painted him as a whistleblower silenced by forces larger than himself. Talk shows debated whether America's corporations were built on rot too dangerous to confront. But the outrage was brief. Within a month, fresh scandals replaced Hanley's case. A senator's affair, a celebrity overdose, another market crash. The nation moved on. Ellen did not. Late at night, she sat alone in the living room, Richard's journal on her lap. Her fingers traced the torn final line, the words unfinished. "If tomorrow I don't come back," she whispered into the silence. You knew, and they killed you for it. But I won't let them erase you. Michael, standing quietly in the doorway, heard her. He stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. They can bury the truth, Mom, he said, his voice steady. But they can't bury Dad. Not in us. Meanwhile, Davenport Global tried to survive the storm. Keene's conviction had given the illusion of justice, but insiders whispered of others, politicians, foreign partners, crime syndicates who had escaped untouched. A junior employee who had spoken with Delaney resigned suddenly and left the country. Another witness recanted his statement under pressure. Servers had been wiped, documents shredded. It was as if the company's walls had absorbed the blood of those who had tried to expose it. In the documentary that would later be made about the case, the closing words were simple, delivered over grainy footage of Richard at his desk. Richard Hanley believed that money always leaves a trail. He was right. But in the world of greed and power, truth itself carries a cost. For him, that cost was his life. And as long as the trail remains unfinished, so too does his story. On a cold evening weeks after the funeral, Ellen and Michael visited the grave. A fresh bouquet lay against the stone, though neither of them had left it. Someone else had come, someone who remembered. The city skyline glowed in the distance, towers of glass and steel shining coldly against the night. Somewhere within those towers, the machine still churned, feeding on silence. Richard Hanley was gone, but the shadow of greed he tried to fight was still very much alive.